The topic that we're beginning with is really a passage in Discourses 117. Epictetus says, tout estin prohairesis, in the context of explaining how a person determines their decisions and actions. And so what we're looking at here is a very important faculty, and then how it actually works. And it's prohairesis itself that determines or compels, depending on how you want to render the passage, prohairesis. And so when this conference was proposed, I talked to Harald and I was like, well, should we do a presentation on maybe this? And he said, yes, yeah, that's a great idea, because this is such a rich passage in implications and associations. And this is an opportunity for the two of us who collaborate on quite a few things. We meet weekly, not only to talk about Stoicism today, but all these other projects within, you could say, the philosophy of action and ethics and things along those lines, mostly in ancient philosophy. It's an opportunity for us to think about a larger set of topics that we're interested in, specifically prohairesis and the notion of the will going through ancient philosophy into the early Middle Ages. And that involves a number of other closely connected topics like freedom and responsibility, how we shape our character, how decisions actually lead to actions, what goes into that, how that operates. And Epictetus is very interesting in that respect, I think. So some of the material and the points that we're presenting here, we're cannibalizing a previous presentation that we made, which had a larger scope at the Aristotle and Aristotelian Tradition Conference this last summer at Marquette University. There we were discussing prohairesis and the epimene in Aristotle, Epictetus, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and Simplicius. So Stoic and Aristotelian traditions. We also drew upon another presentation that I made in the Midwest Seminar in Ancient and Medieval Philosophy some years back on Epictetus and prohairesis. And so we're going to be discussing a number of different aspects bearing on prohairesis and Epictetus's works and thought and Stoic philosophy. But ultimately, it's centering on one main goal, a better understanding of what this passage means and implies, because we think that there's a lot going on packed in there. And so I'm going to give an overview, and then I'm going to hand things off to Harald, and we're going to go back and forth, and this will be much more like a conversation than a strict presentation. So we'll do a short history of the term prohairesis up to Epictetus, and then we'll approach a always controversial topic. Is Epictetus an original thinker? Is he a derivative, very orthodox thinker? Is he somewhere in between? The scholarship is kind of all over the map on that. And then we'll have a short discussion of translations of the term prohairesis. And that might actually be a good place to open up some discussion, or perhaps we'll save that for later. Because, we're looking primarily at English, but also at Latin, but it would be interesting to have some other languages represented. And then we're going to consider some other relevant passages about prohairesis, its scope, its freedom, its value. We're going to look at what prohairesis is as a faculty or the core of the person. And there's a lot of literature out there about that. We're only dealing with a little bit of it here in the presentation, because otherwise it could be, an entire day of summarizing literature that's currently available. But there's some interesting things. And one of the questions that we do want to consider in this literature is, well, is the prohairesis, is it the same thing as the hegemonikon? Is it different from it? Is it overlapping, as some people have suggested? And how does it connect with the rational faculty? And then we're still circling around the topic. We're going to talk about some key ideas and distinctions that prohairesis is connected with, like the epimene, assent. And then we'll get to the actual topic, looking at Epictetus's model about how prohairesis determines, is determined or shaped or structured. One of the key aspects that we want to spend a good bit of time discussing is how prohairesis is reflexive. That is, it works upon itself, as we see in this passage. What kind of modalities does this have? How does this work? How does prohairesis compel or determine itself? And we can ask this in two ways. How does it determine itself well, right? Rationally, prudently, maintaining itself in the right way. And then how does prohairesis mess itself up? You know, all of us have prohaireses that are not in perfect condition. You know, if we accept Epictetus's model, we're all prokoptoi, we're making progress, we're not sages. So how did our prohaireses get so screwed up in the first place? And how do they keep screwing themselves up? That's a good question. And then if we have time, we'll go into the question, another one that Harald and I are grappling with quite a lot. Is prohairesis effectively what we call the will, a locus of freedom in Stoic compatibilism? So Harald will take over at this point. We'll be going back and forth, and sometimes Harald, you should feel free to interject at any time that I'm talking, and I will exercise the same liberty.
Thank you, and please do. So prohairesis is not a particularly common term, and it's a term that seems to be used in a variety of ways, centering on conception of choice, prioritization, and perhaps some deliberation. The term is used by rhetors and orators, like Demosthenes and Isocrates. And Demosthenes uses in the expression prohairesis to bio, choice, a way of life, 4 times in various speeches. The term gets used in verbal form by different orators and speechwriters like Aeschines, Hyperides, and Lysias. It's used in verbal form by Plato too, particularly in the Laws, in the Sophist, Statesman, Philebus, and there's one substantive use in the Parmenides in 143c. When we move to Aristotle, the term gets used a lot, especially in the ethical and political works, both in it's used in the ethics, in the politics, rhetoric, and poetics, and there the focus is on deliberation, virtue and vice, choice, and whether we are responsible for our own moral character. It also gets used on soul, physics, metaphysics, and the focus there is on the philosophy of action and causes. Even gets defined by Aristotle in such a way that turns out not to work well for all the contexts in which he introduces or uses the term. So it's a complex, underdetermined, and very important idea. Poletike orexis ton effemin, which can be translated as either effectively imbued intellect or intellectually oriented affectivity. After Aristotle, we see the term prohairesis getting used occasionally. It's referenced in the Magna Moralia, and there prohairesis is between things that can be done, and it concerns the kind of circumstances in which it is up to us to act or not to act, and to act in this way or not, and in which one can grasp the reason why. And that's in 1189b6 through 25. Philo of Alexandria uses prohairesis to denote something like intention or commitment. And the historian Diodorus Siculus in Bibliotheca Historica uses prohairesis in quite a few places, typically in terms of commitment or character. The Middle Platonist Plutarch, who was contemporary Epictetus, uses prohairesis occasionally in both the lives and various moral treatises. And the meaning there is in choosing the path towards virtue, or in terms of committed choice in politics. And in Cicero, we have voluntas, voluntar, as well as in Lucretius and Seneca, among others. So if you turn to uses in the Stoics prior to Epictetus, it seems like it wasn't a particularly important concept for them. Inwood writes that the old Stoic use of this term diverges from its Aristotelian counterpart more than any other. This is clearly an unimportant term for the old Stoa. And later in Stobaeus, we find a definition of prohairesis as a choice before a choice. We don't see any use of it in Musonius Rufus. It is not a term that Cicero notes as being used and in need of having a Latin translation or equivalent. We also don't see any use of it in Hierocles, and we only see it a few times in Marcus Aurelius. So it seems like it started and died with Epictetus, at least for the Stoics among the surviving sources. It's a tendency among many interpreters to view Epictetus as following along with and transmitting Stoic orthodoxy, which probably is the case in many respects. But we also see Epictetus seemingly incorporating and innovating when it comes to key ideas of Stoicism. There is less emphasis on the virtues. He introduces the three disciplines, which we'll hear about more tomorrow. He has a focus on the distinction between what is ephemine and ephemine, in our control and not in our control, or up to us, not up to us. As well as concepts like prolepsis, and the topic of today, prohairesis. In Epictetus, we also find a reinterpretation of the key Stoic idea of living in accordance with nature as maintaining prohairesis in accordance with nature. Prohairesis is a term that prior to Epictetus seems largely to have been used in any robust manner by Aristotelians and by later Neoplatonists, who are assimilating Aristotle and Epictetus into a Platonic framework. And I'll now pass it back to Greg for the topic of translation.
Yeah, so there's an incredibly wide range of translations in English, not just of prohairesis is used by Epictetus, but also by these other authors like Aristotle, Plutarch, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and authors all the way down to Simplicius, who writes a commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion, which is very, very interesting because it's a Neoplatonist commentary where he's helpfully explaining some things, but it's clearly within a different framework. And the literature that's out there, the way in which these terms are translated is just all over the map. And some people seem to have given a great amount of thought to it. Others seem to have picked whatever term was handiest and just, hoped for the best. And I think it produces a lot of confusion for people who can't simply go back to the Greek. And there's another point to note as well, because we're not just like looking at the present or the near present of, let's say, the last 200 years of scholarship and translation. This is a term that has a life in the ancient period in the West, the two main important languages being Greek and Latin. And so Harald mentioned, voluntas and the, voluntari, or how, whatever other cognates we've got. Sometimes this is used to translate other terms like thelema, the will of fate or the will of the gods. That's right there in Epictetus as well. or boule or boulesis. Boulesis for the Stoics is a type of rational desire, but it has a different function for Aristotle, right? And so these terms are kind of loosey-goosey, to use a very suggestive term. And we see this in like from Seneca down to Augustine. The trouble is that voluntas seems to be the closest thing to Epictetus's prohairesis that we find in the literature, but it's pretty rare that prohairesis actually gets translated by voluntas. In medieval Latin, once the translations of Aristotle get made, it's kind of implausible. Like if you read Thomas's commentary on Nicomachean Ethics, you look at the Latin text and then what Thomas makes of it, it's boulesis that gets translated as voluntas. And you look at what boulesis is in Aristotle and you're like, well, that can't possibly cover the same ground as it. It really should have been prohairesis, but prohairesis gets translated as arbitrium, which is like a modality of voluntas, and oftentimes as liberum arbitrium, free choice of the will. Now, we actually looked at some Latin translations from the Renaissance and later of Epictetus's Enchiridion to see how is prohairesis actually rendered. And we didn't survey all of them, but two of the very early translations, it's interesting to see the terms that are being used. So in the Niccolo Parati translation, this is looking at Enchiridion 4, where the first real focus on prohairesis. Make sure you don't mess up your prohairesis when you go take a bath. It runs like this: Volo equidem lavare, I want to take a bath, sed electionem meam secundum eis naturam se habentem tueri. So prohairesis is being translated as electio, which is clearly a word of choice, right? But maybe doesn't have the full range that we typically associate with it in Epictetus. And then in the Angelo Politano translation, lavare volo, I want to wash myself, right? Propositumque meum quod secundum naturam est servare, to maintain propositum. Usually translated as like my intention, my plan, what it is that I put before me. That it's capturing the deliberative aspect a little bit better, but again, not closely connecting it. In the much looser Edward Ivy and later translation, which is very periphrastic, there isn't any word that corresponds to prohairesis. Instead, he talks about defendere, so to maintain, partus fortis et ingenui. So, it's like a whole set of words that are translating it, and you would never guess that this is actually prohairesis. If we look at English translations of Aristotle's term prohairesis, which is a narrower concept than Epictetus's, choice is a very common translation, often qualified by other terms like deliberate or moral or preferential or purposive. Intention is another one. I kind of like that. Purpose, decision. Harald and I have often used commitment as a good way to translate Aristotelian prohairesis. One that's clearly wrong that Irwin proposes is will. So, if anybody's prohairesis is will, it's going to be Epictetus's, not Aristotle's. What about Epictetus? So here we have a wider range because Epictetus treats prohairesis as a faculty or phenomenon of much broader scope. So we see, this is just this is not a comprehensive list, but faculty of choice, power of choice, moral purpose, disposition. That's from Bobzian's book. Long likes the word volition for all of the seeming dangers of giving the wrong idea. He's cool with that. Long also uses the self or moral character. Inwood talks about moral personality, which I kind of like. Freda at one point in A Free Will translates prohairesis as will. That's a little dicey, but we'll talk about why. And we can ask, what does this range of translations tell us And this is something that Harald and I, as well, I mean, Harald is a translator. I also have translated in the past. This is something I think we're very attuned to, the possibilities of misleading people by choosing the wrong term, and we don't want this to become just a conversation about translation and terminology, but I think this is a really important point. I mean, Harald, do you want to weigh in here on this a bit more? Or?
Yeah, I think that what we need to do when we translate Epictetus is that we must simply give up the pursuit for a perfect word to translate it. I think we need to rely on a glossary. And it's not just prohairesis either. If you take a concept like eudaimonia or even ta adiaphora, the indifferent things.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just translate as, those things that doesn't make a difference, then that's not going to be very helpful unless you sort of explain the Stoic idea that virtue is sufficient for happiness and other things aren't on the same level of goodness.
On a similar note, I think prohairesis is a term that's very difficult to find a good English rendering for that doesn't mislead, So maybe you're right. Maybe having a glossary and indicating at the start that people ought to go to the glossary and look around in there. Maybe that's our strategy,
Yeah, and a very good introduction, I think. And then I think that, at least if we're going to do a new translation in English, then you can just try to pick the least bad amongst the ones that have been used so far. In Norwegian, it's a bit more difficult since, at least the discourses haven't been translated yet. So
that actually, it presents you with an opportunity, but also a greater responsibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can try to base it on some translations of the Ingredient, which has been translated a bunch of times. So I think that the latest that I saw was the ability to choose. What's the translation of prohairesis?
Okay. So now we're going to consider some relevant passages about prohairesis and its scope and freedom and value. So the larger context of the Discourses 117 passage runs more or less like this. This is Harald's translation. And I instead of using Harald's rendering, I've just put prohairesis in there. You have a prohairesis which is secure by nature from hindrance and compulsion. I'll demonstrate that to you first of all in the sphere of assent. Can anyone prevent you from assenting to the truth? No one at all. Can anyone constrain you to accept what is false? No one at all. Do you see that in this area you have a prohairesis that is immune from hindrance, constraint, and obstruction? Well then, are things any different in the sphere of desire and motivation? What can overcome a motive other than another motive, and that alone? What can overpower a desire or aversion except another desire or aversion? So once again, it is your judgment that has constrained you, or in other words, your prohairesis has constrained or determined itself. And this is a very rich passage because what we see here, two things, is, prohairesis is moving both in the realm of desire, motivation, all these affective things, but it's also cognitive. It's moving with, he's saying, you have a prohairesis that's secure by nature from hindrance and compulsion. Let's talk about assent. And there's an interesting, in some of the scholars, there's a tendency to say what the earlier Stoics were meaning by this vast field of assent is part of what Epictetus is calling prohairesis. So that's important. And then we also see that prohairesis works in part by taking our present thing and then replacing it with something else. So this is one way prohairesis actually works upon itself. What can overpower a desire? Well, another desire. And what decides what that desire is going to be? Prohairesis does that, right? So this is a means by which prohairesis modifies itself. There's a couple other key themes that we see coming up, and we could actually find, we could talk about many other passages, so we just picked some representative ones. Prohairesis is the core of what a person is. In book 4, he says, you are prohairesis. So that's a pretty strong equation, right? And then there's a couple other nice ones. You're not flesh nor hair, but prohairesis. So if you get that beautiful, you'll be beautiful. A little later, he says, not flesh or bones or sinews, but that which uses them governs and understands appearances. So, our prohairesis is, in a way, you almost can't say our prohairesis. You are your prohairesis. You are that prohairesis, right? It's also the ethical locus. Good and evil, he says, lie in prohairesis. Outside of prohairesis, there's nothing either good or bad. This can be sometimes taken too far, because obviously you don't want to go the mistaken route of saying, oh, well, then nothing matters to me outside of my own little inner citadel. It's better to say outside of prohairesis, nothing is good or bad intrinsically for you. But, what happens to your neighbor is still good or bad, right? How you treat them is still good or bad. Choices or prioritizations that have to be made. We see a lot of examples where Epictetus says, listen, you got to pick A or B. And interestingly, B will be keeping prohairesis in accordance with nature, which is kind of a higher thing than whatever temptation you have right now. So if we take the bathhouse thing from Enchiridion 4, you can get ticked off about people stealing your towel or making noise or stuff like that, or you can keep your prohairesis in accordance with nature, and you can't have both. So you use your prohairesis to decide which of these you're going to maintain. And then the last really important theme, prohairesis is free, radically free. He tells us that nobody is a master over another's prohairesis in Book 4, Chapter 12. Early on in the Discourses in Book 1, not even Zeus can hinder my prohairesis, right? Zeus gave it to me, but he can't change it. And then in 3:19, he says, nothing outside of the sphere of prohairesis can hamper or injure prohairesis. It alone can hamper or injure itself. So when we blame, our bad condition on, I came from a culture that gave me the wrong ideas, or, it's the media, or, my parents who were mean to me, or my teachers, or whoever, Epictetus, I think he'd be willing to say, okay, those are all, what the Stoics might call auxiliary causes, but the real cause of you being screwed up is you and your prohairesis and your choices that you've made. And you may have been in situations where, unfortunately, it was hard for you to see, like what the right thing was, and you got a lot of bad messages that are all appearances essentially. But it's still you, and this is very optimistic in a way, because if we can be screwed up because of that, we can also fix ourselves, right? So this is a good transition to talking about some of the scholarly literature, and I turn this over to Harald, unless you want to say something about any of these passages.
On the last point, and I think I'll get into it a bit later, but that transitions into the next section actually. But Zurabji mentions the discussion he had with Michael Frede, where he said that, well, prohairesis is free in one sense, but it might also be the case that you need to make it free. I mean, if you have already compelled your prohairesis, then you need to do some work in order to make it in the free condition again.
And this is a little bit outside of the scope of what we were talking about, but this is something that you and I have discussed at a number of points. I think that's right. And I think that we, in traditional virtue ethics, when we're thinking about freedom and moving towards the good and stuff like that, whatever faculty we want to conceive of it as, whether prohairesis or the will or something else, we use that to unscrew itself up, to make it better, to put it in better condition, gradually, cumulatively through a process that usually others have charted out for us, and then we follow, but we have to understand experientially. And so what that implies is we can build freedom, and I think that's again a rather optimistic side to it that often gets left out for people. They want to say either you're free or you're not. It's like an on-off switch, rather, and we could say another alternative is we could see it like a continuum, but in both of those are actually kind of wrong when it comes to prohairesis or the rational faculty. It's more like building a muscle. You know, you have to do that over time. You do it through going into difficult situations. You stress the muscle. It increases its strength and mobility and its capacity to work. Except in this case, it's not a perfect analogy because the muscle doesn't move itself, right? The brain moves the muscle.
Yeah, and perhaps another similarity with the muscle is that if you're not in good shape and you try to deadlift 300 kilos, then you might end up breaking your back. So,
or destroying the muscle. Yeah. That's a good point. How, does that translate well to prohairesis? I mean, there are some examples of people in Epictetus's discourses who have really, really screwed up prohairesis, like the guy who wants to hang out with him and he says, listen, buddy, you're an adulterer. Nobody can trust you. You've taken the man inside of you, the man of trust or faith, right? And you've destroyed him. So that kind of implies that you could damage your prohairesis pretty significantly.
Yeah, and I don't remember any specific place where Epictetus says that you need to be careful about what kind of challenges you introduce yourself to. But I think he says at some point, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, let's say that you become convinced that virtue is the only thing that's really good. And you're a fresh student of Stoicism, then maybe you shouldn't try to get tortured to death. Or, I mean, you should probably avoid that anyways, but I mean, maybe it makes sense to try to be a bit careful about getting into a really challenging situation.
Yeah, again, this takes us a little outside of the scope of it, but John Cassian, and I do think the monastic fathers did incorporate a lot of Stoic stuff into their discipline, not just through Evagrius Ponticus, who is clearly influenced by Stoicism. Cassian advises people to work on only one vice at a time. And he says that if you try to take on too much, you're guaranteed to fail, And I think that's actually really good advice,
Yeah. And it also perhaps ties into the role ethics. I mean, when he talks about the different prosopon and making choices in accordance with your role.
Yeah. And again, something that we hadn't really thought of. Maybe, when you talk about prohairesis, one of its functions is prioritizing. And if you think about Epictetus's role ethics, you have every single role that you have, he says, signifies a set of duties that you have or appropriate actions. How do you prioritize between them? So if you're going to be a good son and a good brother and a good neighbor and a good citizen, sometimes one of those has to give. And so how do you determine that? It's prohairesis that settles that, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay, should we jump to the next section?
Yeah.
All right, so we're now going to go to a section where we try to draw on some of the scholarly discussions of other people, and we're going to try to tackle 4 issues. The first one is understanding what prohairesis is for Epictetus, and the second is what is the scope of prohairesis? What does it extend to? The third issue is prohairesis the same as hegemonikon, the rational faculty? The fourth issue, the rational part, leading part. The fourth issue is prohairesis what comes to be called voluntas, or the will. And these issues tend to be blended together in discussions. So if you turn to the first of the two, Tony Long writes that this faculty, let us call it prohairesis for short, is the essential self, as Epictetus conceives of this, the bearer of personal identity. Kant, in Discovering the Will, writes, prohairesis is presented not only as the decisive factor in practical existence, but as the true self, the inner man, the I of personal identity. Inward in ethics and human action, in early Stoicism, writes, he, Epictetus, has elevated the term to stand for a man's entire free power of choice, which constitutes his moral program for life. And Long again writes in his monography on Epictetus, volition, or prohairesis, is what persons are in terms of their mental faculties, consciousness, character, judgment, goals, and desires. What Epictetus includes under this term is each person's individual self, with the capacity of reason, desire, intention, and reflexive consciousness.
So just to break in, we can see that within the scholarship of people that are really, digging into this and thinking about this quite long and hard, people that Harald and I are taking as, guiding lights. Prohairesis is both the core of the person, and it covers a lot of stuff. Whether we think of it, it's not identical with all of these things, but it runs the show, you could say.
It does. And maybe it's a good place to introduce Zurab's take. I mean, whether there are two prohaireses or not. Epictetus occasionally talks in the sense where it makes sense to read him as saying that. As was Seneca, by the way, from time to time in the first letter, make yourself free for yourself. Do you think that there are multiple selves there, or is it more like...
That's a good question. I mean, it depends on... there's a true self that's like, at the very core or something, and we uncover it or free it up. I don't know. I think that, and again, I don't have this really well articulated or provided with all sorts of textual evidence, but I kind of think that prohairesis is like the rational faculty in that there's no one locus of prohairesis. There's no nugget of it, like, a thing that would always remain exactly the same, something like, substance or ousia. I think prohairesis, like everything else for the Stoics, is made up of other stuff. And in this case, it's like previous volitions that we've engaged in, and but it retains this agency because of the way it's put together. Epictetus will say that reason is a systema, a network of appearances at one point. I think prohairesis is like that as well. There's clearly, and this is something that one of the other people picked out, there's clearly prohairesis in the sense of like what our prohairesis ought to look like a perfect prohairesis completely in accordance with nature. But that's none of us. That's the sage at best, who Epictetus really doesn't talk about at all. And then there's the prohaireses that we have, So I'm not that attracted to this. Like, I mean, we could say there's double senses of prohairesis. I'm cool with that. But I don't know that I want to say that there's actually two prohaireses or two personalities.
Yeah, and I think that Zurab gets a bit uncertain himself from time to time. And he points out that, well, in ordinary English, we can talk in the same way. We can say something like, I hurt myself.
It's reflexive language, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't imply that there are two selves and one is hurting the other.
Yeah, we have a whole bunch of reflexive verbs, and some languages use many more of them, like I wash myself, we don't say that in English, but French, je se lave, right? There's a whole bunch of words there's a whole bunch of verbs that don't make sense unless you have the, personal pronoun in there.
Yeah, or the medium voice in Greek. So
exactly, yeah.
How am I'm stopping myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, shall we turn to the third and fourth issue? So we got some more quotes here. Inwood writes that Prohairesis and Epictetus seems to be in control of the other impulses and faculties, and so is almost equivalent to the hegemonicon. Long writes, in the first discourse, it says that this is the one and only faculty that the gods have placed in our power. What does he mean by this faculty? He glosses it in a number of ways. It is a reasoning faculty, the only faculty that we have that can have cognizance of itself. It is our desidedative and impulsive faculty. It is our capacity to give or withhold assent. It is our prohairesis, our moral character. It is the faculty that tells us whether or not to do something, that passes judgment of the truth and value of anything of which we have a representation. A person's prohairesis is a function of reason, a state of the soul's commanding part. Do you want to say something, Greg?
Well, read the next quote, and then I do have something.
Yeah. The previous quote was from Stoic Studies, and this is from his monography again. This congruence could suggest that the terms are synonymous in Epictetus, but I do not think this is right. Although they overlap in their referent, so far as human beings are concerned, hegemonicon does not mean rationality.
So this is a topic that Harald and I have gone back and forth about, with him taking one position and me taking another position. And the positions are not very far apart. The question is, should we identify prohairesis with two other things, the hegemonicon, the ruling faculty, or the rational part? And my point of view, really until very recently, and now I'm more or less convinced of the point of view Harald has been articulating, is that you've got the hegemonicon, clearly important, clearly a central part of Stoic anthropology. And, prohairesis, I was saying, is just the hegemonicon in a certain way. Likewise, the rational part is, a certain way. And I think there's a lot of places in Epictetus where he uses these pretty synonymously with each other, and where what he's saying about the rational part applies, about its reflexivity applies to the prohairesis or vice versa. And so these are just like different ways of looking at things. The rational part is more about like our reasoning processes, and the prohairesis is more about choice and practical reasoning and that sort of thing, but they're all the hegemonicon. And so like Inwood, it seems almost equivalent. That almost is really key there, right? Long saying there's overlap. I think that's right, but yeah, maybe the hegemonicon is the broader thing, and prohairesis should be seen as a modality of it.
Yeah. I think that is right, and I think I mentioned this earlier too, that I think that Stoics thought that animals have a hegemonicon, but they do not have prohairesis.
Yeah, and they don't have a rational hegemonicon, and maybe that's the key, part of the key difference,
Yeah, and I think that hegemonicon is a bit more. I mean, would the hegemonicon be the thing that actually receives impressions without necessarily ruling on them?
Well, it rules on some of them, right? And it's affected by them as well. So, I mean, again, going beyond our topic, but if we think about like the phenomenology of perception, to use Merleau-Ponty's title and term, we're like taking in what the Stoics call phantasiae all the time, and we're only attending to certain of them, those that we think are, particularly important, and those are at the level of conscious perception. And then we do like decide what we're going to do. Like if I taste my coffee and suddenly there's a bug swimming around in it, and I take a sip and like something's moving around in my mouth, I'm not paying attention to this presentation anymore, or what's going on the screen. I'm paying attention to what's going on in my mouth, and do I spit it out? Do I try to investigate further in a very calm manner? These are all possibilities for my hegemonicon.
Yeah. How are we doing on time now, by the way?
Well, we're getting close to the end, but I don't know if we'll get to anything. Well, we won't get to everything that we planned, but let's keep going with this, because this is a really important thing. And maybe we'll skip over the other key distinctions. Let's talk about the free will stuff.
Free will stuff. All right. Yeah. So that's your section, right? Epictetus model of how prohairesis determines.
Well, we've got three passages here that I think are kind of interesting. So Stephen Strange in Stoicism, Traditions and Transformation says, Augustine, even if he does not create the modern notion of the will, is a much less remote ancestor of it than the Stoics, which implies that the Stoics and Epictetus are doing something different than what we nowadays say. Freitas says something very different. Freitas says we have here we have our first actual notion of a free will, but it's a notion such that not all human beings, in fact, have a free will. They're meant by nature to have a free will. That is, each human being is capable of having a free will. And this is what he says about Epictetus. And then Chris Gill, describing Kant in his book, The Structured Self. Kant has this entire article where he's tracing, the development of free will from like Homer all the way to Augustine. Kant finds in Epictetus a crucial stage in the discovery of the will, a process he traces from Aristotle to Augustine, finally Thomas Aquinas. The main point is the idea of a highly unified locus of motivation and action. In Stoic psychology, this is standardly seen as based on the unified control center, the hegemonikon. In the Stoicism of the late Roman Republic and early Empire, Kant finds the emergence of a new vocabulary for expressing the integrated conception of motivation in the use of voluntas and Seneca and prohairesis and Epictetus. I'm kind of attracted to that view. I think that prohairesis and Epictetus isn't exactly what Augustine means by voluntas. And it's not, like the whole large conception of the will that we have maybe in the present, but it's pretty close, and I like this language of discovering the will, the human being discovering something that's been there all along and just was not particularly well articulated. It's not like, if we're Aristotle, we don't actually have a will. We're just not able to articulate it as well, Yeah. So maybe we should jump down to talking about some of the ways in which, making good on our original promise. How does prohairesis determine itself? So there's a couple things to say about this. In a lot of cases, prohairesis is going to be determined by things that are not prohairesis. There's a receptivity in it to what's outside of it by its very nature. And some of these are uses of prohairesis, what we can call prohairetic decisions or determinations of others. You think about your family and growing up in a certain way, the choices that your family members make, even about like decor or, when you wake up in the morning or when you eat or when you have to go to bed. Education, if teachers do indeed shape us, they're doing it by how they use their prohairesis. The workplace, political and social life. A lot of these are probably not directly aimed at producing, things in our prohairesis. It just happens to do that. But, we get messages, we learn things. Prohairesis is also reflexive. And here we get to the root. Prohairesis determines itself or necessitates or compels itself. But the question we can say then is, well, how does this happen? It's not like a magical process where it just, has a feedback loop circling into itself. And I think we'd be wrong to imagine it like a little homunculus inside of ourselves who's perfectly conscious. And, that's a nice imagination, but that's not what Epictetus says. And it's not remotely like what we experience. When we make choices about ourselves, very often we do so in a consciousness of having made the wrong choices in the past and try to fix ourselves in the present. And we're in this like fog or, limited horizon of, well, how do I unscrew myself up in the present? And here again, Epictetus tells us reason is a systema of appearances. I think we should think of the prohairesis as something complicated, like a system that chooses that we don't have full consciousness of. And it chooses in particular situations and moments and determines itself in for larger contexts. And it's sometimes, we sometimes do this in terms of thinking about very general things. What kind of person do I want to be? But most of the time, like, Harald has mentioned role ethics several times in here. I think a lot of the time we're actually thinking, well, what do I do within the context of this relationship and the responsibilities that I have? So, Harald, do you want to weigh in on some of the more determinate ways in which prohairesis compels or determines itself?
Well, this ties pretty nicely into the next section, and I thought to bring about the discussion on family affection.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, where there's a father who had a sick daughter, which he ran away from. And then Epictetus asked him to defend himself because that seems like a really crappy thing to do. And then he says, well, it's natural. And then they go into a Socratic dialogue on, well, what does it really mean that something is natural? And here we see that Epictetus is not committing the naturalistic fallacy, which we talk about now in more modern philosophy. He doesn't say that, well, because something is common, then it's okay. It's rather natural. It's more like an idealized conception of what a father ought to do. So a father wouldn't run away from his sick daughter. And that is the way in which prohairesis governs itself. You can sort of bring out an idea and try to follow that idea and to see what you ought to do in a certain situation.
And that actually brings out something that's implicit in Epictetus's practice, but he doesn't thematize that much, which is we don't modify our prohairesis just by retreating to the inner citadel, and actually Epictetus says, by the way, your inner citadel, it's a citadel of vices. You got to destroy those because they've built up citadels inside of you before you're going to be able to do anything. But you don't just like retreat within and then think to yourself in a kind of like Cartesian way. You do so in relation to others, and the best part about others is sometimes they can say, "Hey, man, you're screwing up. You need to fix this."
Yeah,
like Epictetus is doing with that guy.
Yeah, and another interesting idea that he has is that, well, you can't really maintain your own relationships unless you focus the good on prohairesis.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting idea. So, yeah. And a few other ways, if I may, in how Epictetus thinks that we can govern prohairesis is that we can bring about counter impressions or reframe a few things. So when he talks about how we can find solitude challenging, well, then he suggests that you try to reframe it as peace of mind, peace and quiet. And if you're bothered by the crowds, then you try to think about the crowd as a festival. So
yeah, those are great examples. Yeah.
And I also think that if you have a problem with particular vice, like lust, for instance, then you can try to bring a counter impression to that, so instead of imagining how it is to have sex with a certain person that you're not supposed to have sex with, you can try to imagine how it would be to be the kind of person who can withstand that kind of temptation.
That's a great way to unpack that line that he has, when you encounter a beautiful girl or boy, well, you just turn to temperance, and you're like, well, how do you do that? So it almost sounds like he's saying, oh, you got temperance inside of you, just bring it up, but just bringing it up means having to deliberately, especially at the beginning, we have to deliberately do exercises. And this leads us, into a larger topic of what Aldo calls, spiritual exercises. I think his work is quite helpful in that respect. But what he's doing is he's just bringing to light stuff that's already there in the texts.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing too, there's another cognitive means, because reframing is cognitive. All the places where Epictetus says, remember this, or have ready at hand, there's a dogma that you're supposed to have like thought through and made part of your repertoire. And so when you get into a situation where your prohairesis, which is not perfect, is tempted to move in this direction, like with anger, you can remind yourself, he's got this, really great analogy about, you've allowed yourself to be scourged and you've got scars, what you're going to like whip yourself some more and like raise, things on top of the scars. And then this is a bodily metaphor, but it, you can apply it and think, oh yeah, I'm really destroying myself by allowing myself to lose my temper in this case. And that's how prohairesis works upon itself,
Yeah. So it's very practical as well as theoretical.
Yeah. There's another thing that I think we could talk about, attentiveness. So, sometimes this gets translated as mindfulness. And actually in the recently published Stoicism Today, Volume 3, there's a great essay in there by Greg Lopez saying that Stoic prosoche maybe isn't the same thing as Buddhist mindfulness. Actually, he's not saying maybe it isn't. He's saying totally not the same thing. And here's the textual evidence why. But attentiveness is itself quite important, and that's something that we can direct using our faculty of choice. I can be attentive or be thoughtless. I can choose to extend my attentiveness as people do in mindfulness practices. And I can also choose not to look at things that I should. If I know that I have an anger problem and somebody points out to me, hey, you're getting angry. If I choose not to listen to them, and take advantage of their better perspective, right? That's my prohairesis. I'm responsible for that. So.
Yeah, I think that it was either Long or Surabhi who made a point that prohairesis is a bit more wider than it is for Aristotle in this regard, since it's not simply a commitment about becoming an athlete or something. It's rather something that goes on all the time. And perhaps attention ties into that too, that you try to be a bit attentive to the inner monologue in your head.
It is interesting, though, that in Aristotle, he doesn't use the word prohairesis there, but it's coming up in the context of whether we're responsible for our characters. He talks about maybe somebody could be excused, and you say, oh, they're just not a person who pays attention to things. And then Aristotle says, well, they've allowed themselves to become that kind of person, which does seem prohairetic, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Yeah. I think in Aristotle, prohairesis is just so underdetermined and mixed up that in some respects, if we can come up with a coherent picture of Epictetean prohairesis, there isn't an equally coherent Aristotelian picture of it to compare side by side,
Yeah. We've gone on for about an hour now. Should we perhaps open for questions?
Yeah, we should probably wrap up. So, long story short, take care of your prohairesis. It's an important thing. Anything else you want to say?
No, that's about it. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Aldo.
Many thanks. I took a lot of notes. Let me see first the questions on the chat from Danilo Patucci. No, not this one. Here.
There was a question there about what is the article. So it's you can find it in the blog Stoicism Today, and also in the recently published book. It's Greg Lopez, Lopez. And I don't remember the exact title offhand, but it's about Stoic mindfulness. Might be mindfulness in Buddhism and Stoicism, but it's easy enough to find. Just Google Lopez, Gregory, Stoic, mindfulness. You should be able to find it pretty quickly.
And he has also another question.
Oh,
Yeah,
this is a good one
interesting
for Harald, because he does a
How
lot.
do you see the
on
relation
idos.
between prohairesis and eidos in Epictetus?
Yeah, Tony Long has written a bit about it. I think there's a sub-chapter in his monologue or his monograph on Epictetus. So that's a good place to start. But I think that there is a connection. If prohairesis deals in with how we habituate and how we not simply habits in the more common sense, but also mental habits, thinking habits, then it seems like eidos, or a sense of shame or integrity, as Tony Long translates, tie into it. We can use our prohairesis in a messed up way and break down our sense of shame, and then it will become easier for us to commit shameful acts.
Yeah, there's also the tendency, because people feel shame, to not attend to what they ought to attend to, right? So this is when people make apologies that aren't real apologies. They say, "Oh, I'm sorry that I made you feel a certain way," or "I'm sorry that you feel that way," right? And the reason why people say stuff like that is because they're unwilling to take genuine responsibility. And why would they feel that way? I mean, they could feel that way because they're just, hopeless narcissists who think that they never do anything wrong. But I think a lot of people do it out of a sense of shame. And every time that you're feeling shame, it's like it presents you with, different paths that you could take. And the prohairesis is what's choosing those paths for you. Do you try to avoid, talking about the situation? Well, that's your prohairesis deciding that. Or do you do the difficult and painful, work of saying, "Oh yeah, I really screwed up. It was me who screwed up. Can I do anything to make this up for you? Are you going to be mad at me for a long time? I guess I have to take that. I can't demand forgiveness from you." That's another way of using. And this is another thing that we didn't talk about. Epictetus, one of the key things that prohairesis does is what's in Greek chresis, which we translate as dealing with or using. And everything that happens to us, all the appearances, all the situations, we can deal with them or use them in certain ways, and that's up to us. Even the things that are external, Epictetus says, they are external and indifferent, but insofar as we can use them, they're not external and indifferent. They are up to us, and they are a matter of the prohairesis. So shame is really important.
And it's got a bad rap lately.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases where it's a good thing to feel ashamed, right?
Yeah, it is. And at least in Norway these days, we talk about being shameless almost like a virtue. I mean, not feeling shame about having a rumbling stomach during a lecture or something, that's probably a good thing. But being able to steal or cheat or rape, in worst case, I mean, you ought to feel shame if you do any of those things.
Aristotle has a very interesting discussion because he doesn't want to consider shame to be a virtue. This is in Nicomachean Ethics book 4, although he does consider it to be a middle state. And he says that a good person won't actually feel shame, but were they to do something that was wrong, like steal somebody's stuff, right? Steal somebody's textbook in a class, steal from your classmate, then they would feel shame. So it's like counterfactual, whereas the shameless person will just do whatever they want to, and that's not a good thing. It's a bad thing,
Yeah, I was talking with Danilo about it, and he presents the passage of Arius Didymus, where Arius talks about these virtues which are not knowledge. And I talked to Danilo, maybe we could put eidos here, because it's not a virtue, because virtue is knowledge for the Stoics.
Yeah.
But there are some virtues that all knowledge is virtue, but not all virtue is knowledge. There are some virtues that depends what was the word, Danilo? Of ascesis, right? Of practicing them.
Right. And we could say that there's components, right? So knowledge is I think it's better to think of it, knowledge, a virtue isn't itself just knowledge. It's knowledge plus, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of points here. First, the point you mentioned at the end of your presentation about prohairesis and the hegemonicon, because usually in the Stoicism, prohairesis is divided into 7 parts: the senses, reproduction capacity, voice, and not the prohairesis, the
Hegemonicon.
the hegemonicon, and in thought, right? Can you say that the prohairesis is the 8th part of the soul, as something like the hegemonicon being aware of itself? Because you can say that the hegemonicon works in a sense automatically. It produces presentations all the time about external and internal things, but prohairesis is totally up to us. We can somehow stop the process and update the opinions you have labeled or you have used in our thought. I have used in other.
I think that a lot of the times the prohairesis is working less deliberatively, less consciously in Epictetus, because there's all these passages where he like connects reasoning processes, and he says, hey, don't get angry at people because they've got these wrong assumptions, and then they reason from them. And that happens in kind of an implicit or automatic way of practical reasoning. And then he likens that to the same thing is going on with like badly formed desires or aversions and habits and stuff like that. So I do think that there is a part, and I do think that both the rational faculty and the prohairesis, they kind of interfuse each other, and they're part of the hegemonicon. I think that a good bit of the time what's happening is unconscious, even for those of us who've made progress, but you're right, there is also this, whatever we want to call it, and it gets difficult to, we use this word reflexivity where it can apply to itself, but existentialists use words like lucidity, like Camus is always talking in that framework, and that's not a bad way, like a light, a sort of illumination of, holy crap, this is me, for better or for worse. I think that's important too, that self-consciousness. And that happens both in terms of like our moral awareness, you could say, which the prohairesis you could think of as that way, and also in terms of our just like rationality, right?
As Harald pointed out, prohairesis is not free in literal sense, but something you can make free, right?
Yeah.
It's not free if it works bad. It is in a bad state, right?
Yeah, and it's not as if it's like free and contentless the way that people often like frame the will and in free will discussions, right? It's already like got all these complex habits built up and things impinging on it, and we have like this little sliver of freedom, whatever we want to call it, this capacity to like go this way rather than this way, or to like pay attention to ourselves and try to be less bad than we are, and the more that we do that, gradually maybe it goes from being a little tiny sliver to being, I don't know, 1/5 of ourselves. But it's never like the totality of who we are. It's not like we're angels in the sense where we have like perfect knowledge and
You share some light on the subject of prohairesis and hexis and ethos, right? But usually I think about prohairesis in an epistemic way concerning the opinions that you can manage the stock of opinions from which the prohairesis take its decisions So can we make prohairesis? How can we make prohairesis free? By scrutinizing these opinions and withholding the assent to the false ones. How do you think about this process?
Yeah, I think
because
that's.
I think it's the Epictetean mode to apply the Socratic methods, right? Of analyzing our own opinions about the world.
You know, and as I was rereading some of the long stuff to prepare for this, in his Epictetus book, Long actually suggests that we should look at Epictetus as a Socratic.
Yeah,
you know, I like that suggestion.
And I think that Epictetus thinks about himself as a Socratic too, to a very large extent.
So we can say analyzing our presentations is some similar to what Socrates did, discussing essential ideas with his friends and so on. It's the Epictetean version of it, right?
Yeah, it's a linguistic process, right? Even if you're doing it in your own head, dialectic is still you having a conversation with yourself.
Testing presentations in less analysis is testing beliefs about reality, right? About what we are, about the external world, and so on.
I mean, you brought up this as being an epistemic process, but I kind of think that what we see in these robust virtue ethics, whether it's Platonist or Aristotelian or Stoic or later Christian stuff, is the intersection of epistemological and moral motifs. There's many ways. It's interesting because there's this whole field that developed in analytic philosophy where they totally reinvented wheels called virtue epistemology, right? And when it came out, those of us who are doing history of philosophy were like, well, this is not something new. This has actually been done through ancient philosophy. The entire critical thinking movement is kind of doing this before you guys came to it. I actually wrote a paper a while back about how phenomenology, people like Shaler and von Hildenbrand and Marcel were already attuned to this. But it is good that analytic philosophers came to realize that epistemology and moral philosophy do intersect with each other, There's so many ways in which we can't know things adequately. We can know things like we can go on Wikipedia and look things up, but we don't know what to do with that information unless we've had some sort of moral formation. And we don't even necessarily have to be good. This thing about shame. If we are motivated by an understanding of how badly off we are in relation to where we ought to be, that can tell us something epistemologically. We could learn maybe I shouldn't trust the things that people are telling me, right? Or I should only listen to certain sources.
Danilo, he said that according to Aristotle, virtue is as a dynamism acquired by ascesis.
Yeah, that's
capacity.
That's a great thing too. So, like going back to the thing about is virtue just knowledge? If virtue was just knowledge, then we wouldn't need ascesis.
Exactly. That's the whole point. Yeah.
But I think that the Stoics had a more restrictive sense of knowledge than what we do. I think that they would say that, well, if I steal a bar of chocolate from the store, then I don't really know that is wrong. I can say that I might know that's against the law or something like that, but knowledge seems to be something a bit deeper. It's about internalizing a set of notions rather than simply having a passive sense that, for instance, New York is on the eastern coast of the United States.
We could talk about different modes of knowledge, right? And this is getting aside, going out of the Stoic perspective. This is one of the big problems in Plato's texts that I think later Neoplatonists managed to deal with better, even Middle Platonists like Plutarch. With Plato, the bar for what counts as knowledge is very, very high. And everything gets thrown into the same basket, you know?
Yeah.
And he often uses techne and episteme as if they're basically synonyms with each other. So, you know, medicine is a knowledge, rhetoric is a knowledge, or maybe not. Maybe it's just a knack, you know, but maybe if it's the good rhetoric. And when we get to Aristotle, we see it's not a perfect account, but at least there's an attentiveness to different modalities of knowledge. So phronesis is something quite different than techne or episteme, you know. I think that's quite important. And then, you know, we see further refinements of this as we get further along.
There's another note of Danilo Patucci. Just think loud, and then his choices implies the choice in our values as persons, in our integrity or lack of integrity, in the values we attribute to ourselves by action of ideas as moral instance. Yeah, that's a good and complicated question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
There are times when we can have almost like this double consciousness where we're not ashamed about something and we're like, I should probably feel ashamed about this. And so we feel almost like on a higher level, a sense that it's not yet shame. It's a sense something is wrong because we're not feeling shame. And then we say, how am I far gone? Am I too far gone to improve myself? You know, am I shameless? Right. And in some of the cases, it might be like what Harald was talking about, like your stomach rumbling. So for instance, I had a mother and she never really got it to stick with me. She did not like people to spit on the ground. And it was a very irrational thing. I don't know where it came from for her, but she would see people like across the street doing it, and she would like make, you know, mean faces at them. And she told us we should never do it. And I never saw it as that big of a deal. That's clearly the kind of thing that we probably shouldn't feel shame about. And if we do, it's because we've had ideas imposed upon us, right? You know, passing wind, people get very ashamed about that to the extent that they hold it into the detriment of their health. Benjamin Franklin, back in the days, actually wrote a book about this called "Fart Proudly." You know, well, so there's some things that we probably, you know, need to feel less shame about.
I think Epictetus has in mind that kind of shame you feel sometimes. You know, there are so shameful things we do that even years later we remember it and feel shame. And sometimes we feel shame about the other. You see the other doing such a shameful act that we feel it as we did it ourselves. It's very.
When I was a kid, and I would watch situation comedies on television. I think there's a lot of other people who have this experience. You know, they're set up to have goofy situations happen, and somebody does something embarrassing, and then you feel almost what would you call it? A sympathetic sort of shame for them. For me, that was so strong that sometimes I had to leave the room and not watch the show because I felt so bad for them.
Yeah. Isn't that cringe? Cringing?
I think feeling something cringy is it's more centered on the other person. There's less of a I feel this for you aspect. I mean, the concept of cringe is one that probably could use a significant analysis, right? And we're still inventing our moral vocabulary as time goes on. Is there a Portuguese like cognate or similar term to what in English we call cringe?
I don't know. I never see this word before. Let's ask Marcus. He's also an English teacher.
Yeah.
What do you think, Marcus?
I think you're muted still.
Yeah. Let me see in the dictionary.
Well, I don't know if you have another good word for that, but let me take this opportunity to say something. Aldo, maybe we found some good link between Galen and Epictetus.
Yeah, I was talking
this
about.
is very interesting because we have been talking about prohairesis in Galen. I've been working on Galen's PHP, and prohairesis shows up 23 times in PHP. But I got some very important information from you guys that I was not aware of. If prohairesis is not in the Stoa, let's say Zeno, Diogenes, Chrysippus, but it is very strong. It is very strong in Epictetus, and prohairesis is very important for Galen, and he is using prohairesis to determine the location of the hegemonicon. So at this point, I don't know if prohairesis is the hegemonicon itself or is some part of the hegemonicon or some function of the hegemonicon. I'm not sure about that yet. Lacey translates prohairesis as choice most of the time, or volition, which would be the same thing. And sometimes when it comes with kinesis, it's like a voluntary action, which is an action by choice, I guess. It is, but when you guys told us that this is not in the Stoa, I went to check the PHP, and it is interesting because the quotes that PHP has from Chrysippus, Zeno, Diogenes, yes, prohairesis does not show up there. So it is something that it is in Galen, and we know that Galen have written a book about Epictetus. But we don't know what this book is about, and then we have been looking for a link, and maybe for the first time we have a very strong link now. It's very, very interesting.
This is a place where we're so handicapped by the total loss of the early Stoic literature and the middle Stoic literature too, because if there's anybody where we would have expected to see some comparative analysis of it, it would be Posidonius, but we have these book titles and we don't know what's in these very interesting books unless we have glosses. Often, Galen is not a hostile witness the way Plutarch is, but he's not a totally sympathetic witness either, right?
Yeah, he has some problems.
It is interesting too, as we mentioned. So Marcus Aurelius really likes Epictetus and brings him up all the time. Prohairesis is not a concept from Epictetus that Marcus seems very interested in. And Galen and Marcus, there's a connection there, Yeah. So, it's hard to know what to make of this stuff. Harald, do you have any ideas about?
No, not really. But it might be that the other Stoics thought that they could talk about the same thing with more established concepts like hairesis or ecclesis or something like that. But then again, the problem is, why did Epictetus feel the need to pick up prohairesis?
What?
That's the question.
Inwood talks about this in his book on early Stoicism, and he says that his take is that the Stoics want to produce their own vocabulary that is going to take up some of the same space that the Aristotelians and Platonists and others are using. And so if the Aristotelians are using prohairesis, the Stoics are not going to use it. They're going to use other things instead and focus on assent, and that kind of makes sense to me. Where it's not like a deliberative, they all got together in committee and decided, okay, resolved, we will not use the term prohairesis.
And it's always a problem of insufficient sources. I mean, if we had access to all the stuff that Epictetus read as he was living, then maybe it would have been obvious why he went for that term rather than one of the others.
Yeah. I mean, and the only reference that we have in Epictetus's existing discourses to Aristotelians is not it's not an endorsement of them. It's they're like they're like Epicureans, only with a little bit more consistency or something like that. It's not there's something to emulate.
Yeah.
Talking about the Aristotle, what do you think that Epictetus? Do you think that Epictetus took Prohairesis from Aristotle, as Anthony Long proposes, or he's in fact answering some peripatetic attacks and using the own peripatetic words to answer it as dubbing? Dubbing is the
and then transforming the concept, right?
Dubbing, who translated the part of that we put here. I don't know how to pronounce it. Dubbing.
I mean, it's not just Aristotle who uses it. It is being used by other people who aren't Stoics. You know, like I mentioned, you know, Plutarch. Epictetus isn't getting it from Plutarch, obviously, but it's showing up there. And so maybe there's like a current, not so much of Aristotle, but a broader current of use of the term. Again, you know, if we had Posidonius's works, you know, maybe we'd find, you know, connections there, because he engages Plato and Aristotle deliberately, and is willing to say, you know, they got some things right that the Stoics didn't get right. I don't know. Or maybe if we had more of Musonius Rufus's stuff, maybe he talked about it, but we don't know. We only have those, you know, handful of lectures and then a few fragments.
That's a real mystery.
Yeah. I mean, we can hope that, you know, as more of the materials at Herculaneum come about, that maybe we find some Stoic stuff in there, but it seems the prospects seem pretty unlikely.
Maybe from Herculaneum library.
Yeah.
They will read some of those Carbonides and Codices, right?
Yeah.
Danilo said that we don't have a synonym for this word in Brazil.
Yeah, okay.
Usually we say that we feel the shame of the other. We use an expression.
Yeah. We actually say cringe in Norwegian too.
So it's just like becoming a loan word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you think about putting the prohairesis in a good state? Because Epictetus sometimes he says that we are our own opinions, and other times he says that we are our prohairesis. So he established a link between our beliefs and our prohairesis. And how can you put the prohairesis in a good state from this point of view?
I mean, part of it is figuring out which of our beliefs are false or alienating us from other people or getting in the way of our performing our duties. And there's usually a lot of those once we start looking into it. And it's very much, you know, with moral improvement, it's very much like peeling an onion, right? We start out, we start reading the Stoics or Aristotle or whoever, and we're like, oh, this is really great. I can start working on this one little bit of myself that I thought was, you know, not really great, because I'm otherwise really great. And we start digging into it, and it turns out, oh no, it's a bigger problem than I thought, you know, and it becomes a lifelong process, you know, and over time we come to realize just how badly off we actually are, and how our parents kind of screwed us up, and education, you know, there's all these things to it, right? But I think, you know, the beliefs are really central to that, right? So maybe we have a requirement, you know, and so in a certain respect, Descartes is kind of exemplary in this. I want to actually take some time in a stove-heated room now that I've got some leisure to like think through all the various BS that I've accumulated and, you know, think to be true. That's not a bad idea, you know. Maybe treating it all as false that's a problem. But you could also see that as a deliberate effort to break the hold that those things have on us. Descartes is influenced by the Stoics. We know that. What do you think, Harald?
Yeah, well, I think that is right, and I think that's in the text as well. I mean, it does talk about working on our conceptions or prolepses.
Right, yeah.
And especially about what is beneficent. I mean, that's a big one.
Yeah. Another thing that's a set of prolepses, what is in our power and what's not. Epictetus thinks that we're confused about that to begin with. And that, we have to work on that over time. So it's not so simple as like you put somebody, you give them Enchiridion 1. I think this is where a lot of people doing modern Stoicism sometimes go off the track. They're like, dichotomy control, that's all I need, man. And all I got to do is read, the Enchiridion and maybe book 1, chapter 1 of the Discourses, and now I know everything I need to know about it. And then they get themselves into all sorts of trouble because Stoicism is a complex system, right? So,
yeah,
that's what I was about to say. Epictetus, in particular, looks at first sight very simple, but it's very complex, right?
Yeah.
It's extremely complex, and it's a problem to not only to understand it, understand his philosophy, but also to translate him.
Yeah,
it's a very complex philosophy.
Yeah,
and people think otherwise because they read the manual. That's easy.
Yeah, Stoicism is just chicken soup for the soul. I mean, I don't think that's right at all.
Yeah.
So
well, and actually, those sort of misunderstandings of Stoicism, I think, contain ways of going astray. So, and ways that, like, if Epictetus were around today, he probably would have a similar Socratic discourse, like the guy who claimed that he was motivated by familial affection to leave his daughter. So, if Epictetus were around today, he probably would be, calling onto the proverbial mat some people who have these very simplistic takes and saying, well, let's think this out. What's wrong with this? If you do retreat just inside of yourself, aren't you leaving other people that you have responsibilities to in the lurch? If you're a parent, just withdrawing from everything that bothers you, or saying, oh, you're just an appearance, you don't really matter when your kid is getting bullied, that's a problem,
Yeah.
And that ties into a big question that we didn't discuss, but whether Epictetus's idea of the self is fundamentally different from, for instance, Heracles. So Heracles seems to have this idea that you're supposed to extend the self, while it seems like Epictetus is trying to narrow it down to the minimal. So that's maybe a topic for another day.
It would be interesting to discuss tensions between the Stoic figures that we do have, rather, because there's a tendency, I think, for a lot of people to say, well, they must all be basically thinking the same thing. Let's see if we can, systematize them all into one vast thing. And I think Aldo is doing that. That's part of why I don't buy the Epictetean 3 discourses, or the three topoi, being like the hermeneutic to understanding the Stoic system, because it's pretty late. And then there's also a counter tendency to like, well, there's the real Stoics and then there's Seneca, who's not a real Stoic because he's a rich guy and he liked the Epicureans, And I think what we actually need is a much more nuanced understanding that makes room for the differences between the Stoics, and also, so bringing in Galen, bringing in Cicero, bringing in Plutarch, these people who are not themselves Stoics, but have a lot to tell us. I mean, from Cicero, we learn so much that otherwise would be lost to us,
I guess, Gregory, if you try to draw a line on Stoicism, you're going to get into a big mess. It is not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you propose instead of a line? Like something like continua, or?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a challenge, and it seems like in the beginning it was even wider. So we had someone like Aristotle, for instance. It was quite in disagreement with Zeno and Chrysippus.
Yeah, and Zeno himself we could consider to be sort of an eclectic, right? He studies with representatives of 3 different schools. He's also modeling himself after this Socrates guy who has influenced these 3 different schools, the Cynic, the Megarian. and
Zeno didn't call himself a Stoic at all.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a Socratic.
Yeah.
I think that by now we have a very simplified picture of what was Stoicism in the past, because we just started to study all the material. There are a lot of material, a lot of texts that nobody read, and I think maybe in 100 years we will have a better picture. I'm not kidding. I think it's a lot of time to understand all this and to.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that in a way the phenomenon that we call modern Stoicism is creating more of this simplistic picture because there's people out there who want to self-identify to the point where they're bringing in all sorts of things that are like total externals. I'm going to get a Stoic tattoo, or things along those lines. And it's very much like I want to join a club, and then you need to have boundaries. Do you think the modern Stoic phenomena is creating some problems in this way?
Well,
maybe, but also the Pierre Hadot, simplified a lot the picture. As you said, he presented. He's a great researcher, and I'm not putting it in doubt. But his view about Stoicism is too simplistic, right? And many people took it as he put it, and I think it does not help us to understand more, to go deeper in the studies of Stoicism.
Yeah, my question is, how can you make it simple if it is something so complex? That's my question. And the second point is that when you try to do that, there is a good chance you're going to ignore the physics and the logic of the Stoicism. That's the point. Yeah.
Or you can say there's a correlative thing, because what we have of the logic and even more the physics is rather fragmentary, or it's we're like very indebted to Cicero. Like if we think about what's the Stoic theology, well, a lot of it we get from On the Nature of the Gods, and that might or might not be accurate. I think a lot of people who get into that and they say, we have to have. Which is, I think you're completely right. It has to be integrated, right?
Yeah.
Then it's almost like they're sort of like fundamentalists with the Bible. They do a lot of proof texting from the little passages that we have, rather than a more attentive and thoughtful. Let's put these things together, and where we're relying on a testimony rather than a direct passage, we have to be a bit careful. Yeah.
That's the point. I think that Stoicism today is like mass culture of mass, and as a religion also, and it's not relying anymore on the books, as Sloterdijk says in his paper about the new human park. I don't know if you read it. He says that the old culture of learning through books is dying. And now the postmodern ways of communication are killing the ancient ways of thinking and everything. And Stoicism, as religion, as everything else, is going through these postmodern ways of communication, and it is at the same time being diminished. It's being adapted to run through this.
I'm very skeptical of trying to make Stoicism into a substitute for religion for people who have abandoned whatever religious background that they had to satisfy some urges, because what we know of Stoic religion is there isn't any real prayer. We have the prayer to Zeus, but it's basically, hey, let things just go the way they go. Epictetus says don't go to divination, or if you do, only for things where you've like exhausted every other resource. So what would a Stoic religion really look like? I mean, you can talk about religiosity.
Yeah,
right?
I get Gregory. Do you think that the Stoic religion is more physics than anything?
Well, that's where we would
That's
find
the
it.
focus.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because the cosmology is all in there.
Exactly.
You know, in ancient physics also, like, so Aristotle's On the Soul is considered a physical text, right? So the stuff that we're learning about how the body and the mind, you know, really are the same thing, interact, because it's all, you know, substance and pneuma for the Stoics. They're materialists. You know, that's physics, right? I guess you could actually consider Seneca's Letters of Consolation, where he gets he's got the stuff about the astral. Maybe he's a good guy, he'll live in the stars. That's physics too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but the cosmology, the religion, the cosmology from the Stoic is very beautiful. It's very
yeah, and so you can have an attitude towards it of like awe, or you know, a reception of beauty or something like that. And that, I think, if that's what you mean by religion, then I don't see any problem with that. It's when it turns into like talismans and, you know, almost like superstition, right? Carrying around a Stoic challenge coin, you know, helps me with my memento mori or something like that. That strikes me as like no different than somebody, you know, with a WWJD bracelet, or, you know.
Another issue we have today is that who is trying to do that, make the Stoa a very nice religion expression. Yeah, it has some problems to get rid of the influence from the Christianism. So it kind of mix everything, and then it is not Stoa anymore.
Yeah, I've even seen somebody put out something they call the Stoic breviary, and I think a breviary is a great thing, you know, because if you want to learn about Christian monasticism, one of the best ways to do it, besides reading the monks, is to pray the Liturgy of the Hours and see what that's like, right? But I don't think that's the way most people treat a breviary. They treat it almost something more like a rosary, you know, this repetitive thing that you do, and which, you know, can be good for some people, but does very often look much more like superstition than religion. You know,
I agree. Yeah.
In my view, there is a spirituality in Stoicism, but not as a religion, but something similar to. I always think about Carl Sagan. And, the way he sees the cosmos, and he says that it's beautiful, and so you must study physics because through it you know cosmos, you know the true beauty, something about it. And if you see, for instance, Seneca, he wrote a whole book about physics, and in it he says that it's the most important part of philosophy. Yeah. And so I think the Stoics gave a lot of value to perceiving the beauty of the universe through the study of what they called then physics, right?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the quotes from Chrysippus that has actually been transmitted all the way down to us now. That I think he said something like, "Oh, there's no better place to start to learn about ethics than contemplating the cosmos," or something to that effect. So I think that the Stoics thought that the connection between physics and ethics was very tight.
So let me throw a question out there. You know, we live in a very different different universe cosmologically than what the ancients had. Do we still have the same? Does it still have the same resource for us of, you know, providing us with beauty? You know, we don't have a nice, orderly, structured heavens or anything with spheres, let alone with, you know, beautiful music or stuff like that. But we do have, you know, it's pretty cool to like learn about what's out there. You know, what the picture we have is much vaster. I think for some people it's scary, right? They're like, we're this tiny insignificant thing. Now we actually know how deeply insignificant we are. But I mean, you could have that back in ancient times. I think it just wasn't quite as big. So I don't know. Does thinking about things? Let's say we were to take a Stoic physics, and a modified one attitude towards things. Does it have the same capacity to move us in the present?
I think that one important thing is that you can explain the cosmos with math, and I think that one of the key ideas for the Stoics is that the cosmos is rational in a sense. And when you are able to explain the cosmos by math and by a handful of physical constants, then I think that they still would claim that the universe is rational in a sense.
Yeah, but maybe we lost the connection. Compared with the Stoic experience, I think we lost the connection. And maybe by, simple things like we live in big cities today.
Yeah.
With so many lights, and we don't see the sky anymore.
Yeah.
For example. So we don't have that kind of relationship with the cosmos anymore. I mean,
if we live in a big city, we go to the planetarium.
Exactly. Yeah, because
there's a program that okay, now we're looking at this.
Yeah, and I think the first experience comes from this contemplation.
Yeah,
that what moves people to thinking about the cosmos is you see yourself facing something that is so amazing, but we don't have that experience today. Yeah.
The starry sky above me and the moral law within me.
Yeah.
Kant.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't have to go very far. I mean, Königsberg must have had some light pollution, but he could just walk outside the city limits and open himself up to that. Yeah.
This is what called my attention at first in Stoicism, because it put me again in relation to nature. In our culture, we are humans and nature are totally separate in many aspects, and Stoicism put us together again.
Although nature keeps breaking its way back in, like the emblem of the grass breaking through the concrete is a good one. Then you can keep killing it with pesticide or painting over it or laying more concrete, but it still resists us. It's not the same thing as a full. It's not like going out into an actual nature preserve and getting to experience what it's like to be in a place that doesn't have any concrete. But it does afford us opportunities. I mean, we're really fortunate here in Milwaukee, the city that I live in, because Milwaukee had a significant influence from the Germans who fled the revolutions after they failed in 1848. And so one of the things that they felt was that poor people should have access to green space, to parks. And so we have, for the size of our city, we have many more parks than many other cities. And it's something that's part of our way of life compared to, say, our larger sister city to the south, Chicago, where there are there's parks, but just not as much. And it does affect a person's way of life. And this goes to, back to that question that Aldo had about beliefs in the Prohairesis. It requires a certain kind of attentiveness, because it's really easy to walk down the street and not pay attention to anything around you. Yeah. Or to be a kid who's on their phone all the time and not looking at the stuff when they're being taken to the park.
Yeah, a friend of mine likes to say that we will never destroy nature. Nature will destroy us. Yeah. We have been trying to do that for centuries. I mean, we have been trying to kill the rats. If you're thinking about New York, they have more rats than human beings. Mosquitoes, cockroaches, everything. They still live in, and as you said, you see the little seed blooming through the concrete. It's amazing. Yeah.
And I don't think we've been able to kill metaphysics either. So I think that tends to pop up
There's actually an article by Jean-Luc Marion that came out like in the 90s called "The End of Metaphysics." Because by that point in time, there's a whole century of everybody declaring metaphysics over, right? And Mario was pointing out none of these
It's not
actually
gonna work.
Yeah, that's something I heard sometimes. People say, "Oh, Stoicism too old. How can it be useful today?" But I say, but Christianism is also very old, and people follow it anyway. There's no problem, right?
Yeah.
And an idea doesn't become any truer by being neither old nor new. I mean, that's actually irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
It does not survive for no reason, right?
Yeah.
Hey guys, I think it was an excellent talk.
Yeah,
I really appreciate
far-ranging.
your presentation, and I'm really happy about it.
thank you. It was great to be here.
Yeah.
And I hope
thanks so much for organizing
sometime we
this.
can have a draft together. I don't know if you drink, but or orange juice. I don't know. I prefer a draft of beer, but
Me too. Yeah.
That'd be great.
And Marcos, something else to say?
Well, thank you, Gregory and Harold. Very nice contribution. It was really important for me because I'm going through some research on prohairesis, and that was so nice to hear all the information that you guys brought to us. Thank you very much.
Oh,
I put in the chat the link to Modern Stoicism, which Greg and Harold are the editors, right? And you have some message to the Brazilians.
Obrigado. That's only,
Yeah, my
only word I
Portuguese
know.
is so limited.
Good accent.
Thank you.
Okay, and if you want to, we will make a dossier of this symposium, this seminar. And if you want to send us some text to translate it to the Portuguese, please, you are welcome.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right.
I think the Brazilians must know more about your excellent job.
Yes.
Excellent work on
Good
Stoicism.
idea, Aldo. Good idea. We can translate. Yeah, that's nice.
And thank you for having us. This was a great experience.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Many thanks, and until soon.
We'll see you
Yeah.
later.
See you soon.
See ya.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.